Ivan, we're talking about the historical books of the Old Testament, and maybe we could start by talking a little bit about the nature of those books and why they're important. So what are the historical books of the Old Testament? What are we talking about?
Yes, the historical books is a name given to a section of the Old Testament, the Christian Protestant Old Testament, and it contains 12 books. And those 12 books are Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Those are the 12 books that make up the historical book section, and they are absolutely vital and crucial for our understanding of God's plan of salvation to save the world. You can subdivide those books into two parts. You can subdivide, scholars subdivide the historical books into a larger and a smaller section.
Okay.
The largest section actually goes from Genesis to 2nd Kings. And that group of books, Genesis to 2nd Kings, I know it overlaps also the law, the Pentateuch, but for our purposes here, the Genesis to 2nd Kings scholars refer to as the primary history. And the Chronicles to Esther, they refer to as the secondary history. Now the reason why they make that distinction is because the Genesis to 2nd Kings corpus of books is seen as the primary backbone of the Old Testament, from which all of the other books hang. So, for example, the poetical books, Proverbs, Psalms, Song of Songs, and the prophetic books will all hang off that primary spine that goes from Genesis to 2nd Kings. And it covers a very crucial period of history, and that is pretty much from creation, Genesis, creation of the world, to Israel being redeemed as a people, the Exodus, Israel being given her covenant law, Israel entering the land that was promised to her in Joshua, Israel receiving her monarchy, her king in the books of Samuel, and unfortunately after that, Israel losing the land and going into exile. And so the primary history ends really on a dark note. It starts off great in Genesis 1 with the creation and the establishment of the human community and all of that and God's plan of redeeming the world, but it ends tragically with the plan seeming to have gone off the rails. And God's people, his covenant people now, in disobedience and pretty much put on the shelf, standing in the corner as it were, in exile. 2nd Kings ends in 2nd Kings chapter 35 on a fairly dark note. The author will tell you that it's the 37th year of the exile. And that's where we end the primary history. The secondary history, which is mainly Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther, that traverses the same period. Like Chronicles will go back to Adam, the genealogy will go back to Adam, but it ends at a much further time in history. It covers Adam all the way down to the exile where Kings ends, but then it goes further and brings follows the people back into the land after the exile and ends up with the people in the land. So those are the historical books, and as I said, they are absolutely crucial for our understanding of God's plan of salvation.
Yeah, maybe you could unpack that idea a little bit for us. As Christians, we tend to focus on the New Testament.
Yes.
And the historical books are telling the story of an ancient people. So
right.
A lot of Christians maybe they need a little bit of convincing that this is really important for us to read as well. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, the primary reason why we need the historical books is because as we said, the plan of salvation does not begin in the New Testament. The plan of salvation that the New Testament picks up with Jesus Christ has a massive history behind it. God didn't parachute Jesus, as it were, out of the blue into the world to come and save it. His coming into the world as a baby was a plan that had been established generations ago. And unless you follow that plan from beginning to end, especially to the point of Jesus, it's like entering a room where a conversation is already taking place and you're just late to the party and people are talking about something and you just try to pick up the conversation right there and blurt out whatever you think is going on and try to enter into it without taking the time to find out what have they been talking about. You're going to look pretty foolish because you do not know what the conversation has been up to now. And the New Testament itself makes this very clear because the first book of the New Testament is Matthew. And where does Matthew begin? He doesn't begin with the birth of Jesus. He begins with the genealogy of Jesus. And he connects that genealogy all the way back to Abraham, telling you basically, look, if you cannot start with Jesus. There is a history going back here. And if you want to know where Jesus comes from and why he is here, you need to understand that history. So the primary history and the historical books are essential for understanding God's full-orbed plan to save the world that culminates in the coming of Christ. But if you don't pay attention to these things and just think the New Testament is enough for you, then the New Testament is really an orphan without these books. These books are what give the New Testament its parentage. And many things will not make sense to you. For example, you would not understand Paul's argument about why the covenant goes back to Abraham. And that's the covenant we are in. Not even in the Mosaic covenant, but in the Abrahamic covenant. You won't get that if you don't have the historical books. Even the rest of the Old Testament, for example, the prophets, you will not be able to make much sense of their oracles and their teachings if you don't know the social and historical background that the historical books provide for understanding their oracles. And books like the Psalms would be completely incomprehensible if you didn't understand the Davidic monarchy and its establishment and its the tragic events that happened with it. Because all of these things require that backbone from which they get their energy and their meaning. So it's absolutely essential that we pay attention to these series of books.
I can remember as a newer Christian when it kind of dawned on me how the historical books and say the books of prophecy were connected.
Yes.
Because in our Bibles, the prophecy books come later in the list of books.
Right.
And I'd always assume, well, that means all of that's taking place later. But really, the prophetic books are kind of the record of the preaching of the prophets that are happening during that period of time described in the historical books. Most of what we see in terms of genre or literary style tends to be storytelling, telling a story, sometimes called narrative. Could you talk a little bit about, what we actually mean by narrative, what we mean by history? Is that the same thing, or are there some differences?
Right. Narrative is a type of literature that is in the Bible. About 40% of the Bible is narrative. There's actually probably more poetry in the Bible than even narrative, but certainly in the Old Testament, there is probably poetry is bigger than the narrative portions. It's a very very interesting type of genre because it is you need to have some understanding of how the authors constructed their stories in order to properly read the narrative. Prior to about 40, maybe 50 years ago, we didn't really understand the narrative characteristic of these stories, of this portion of the Bible. And so scholars, when they studied this section, they approached it more from a literary point of view. And what they began to see in these sections of the Bible was a whole bunch of problems that needed to be solved. And some of these problems were things like, in a number of stories, very important stories, you'll get two of them. You'll get two versions of them. For example, you will get two creation accounts. You'll get a creation account in Genesis 1, and then you'll get a second one in Genesis 2. And these actual facts. They're not making this up. You will find three versions of the patriarch's wife in danger. Abraham's and Sarah, because of his lies, Abraham putting Sarah in danger. You'll find that with the Egyptians. He does that with the Egyptians, and then he repeats it with the Philistines in Genesis 12 and then in Genesis 20. You'll also find that with Isaac doing the same thing. And so there is repetition. Then there are other things like, well, there appear to be contradictions in the Bible. Contradictions to the traditional view that one author wrote this whole narrative. For example, did Moses really compose his own obituary, his own death account, and how he was buried? Did Moses, who somebody claims to be the most humble man, write that he was the most humble man in Numbers chapter 12? How did David come into the service of Saul? Let me give you just one example to show you the dangers not the dangers, I should say, the problems that these people noticed with the narrative, and so decided they needed to find a way to solve this. If you look at 1 Samuel 16, this is what we will read about David coming into the presence of Saul. Saul's attendant said to him, "See, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let the Lord command his servants here to search for someone who can play the lyre," which is a stringed instrument. "He will play when the evil spirit comes from God from you, and you will feel better." So Saul said to his servants, "Find someone." One of the servants answered, "I have seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the lyre. He is a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is fine looking. And the Lord is with him." Then Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me your son David, who is with the sheep." So they did. David came to Saul and entered into his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor bearers. Then Saul sent word to Jesse, saying, "Allow David to remain in my service, for I am pleased with him." Okay? That's 1 Samuel chapter 16. Now look at 1 Samuel chapter 17. This is after David has killed Goliath, and Saul watches him coming off the battle. 1 Samuel 17, verse 55. As Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this young man?" Abner replied, "As surely as you live, your majesty, I don't know." The king said, "Find out whose son this young man is." Now, probably we've read that, but we've never really noticed some problem here. Like in chapter 16, Saul met David and they became very close. In fact, he's armor bearer. And here, one chapter later, it appears Saul has never met him before, and he's asking Abner, "Who is this?" So this is the kind of stuff that led these scholars to say, we cannot posit here one author because they would not contradict themselves in this way. And so they invented a whole bunch of tools, all of which were designed to try and understand how the text was put together. They tried to dig behind the text to look at the process by which the text was put together so that we got the final product. They were not interested in the final product. The final product was only interesting to them insofar as it showcased these problems. The interesting thing for them was, well, what was the history behind the text? Let us try and understand that. It was known as source criticism, form criticism, redaction criticism. They invented all of these different tools. Those sort of studies did help us a lot. They shed gave us a lot of good information, but they were very unsatisfying because they left the text in pieces on the floor after they were done. They never reintegrated the text into a coherent story, as it appears to be in the Bible for us. God didn't give us sources. God didn't give us different parts. He gave us a whole story. And so people were unsatisfied with those approaches. And so how thankful I am personally that about 40 years ago, a group of scholars began to say, enough of that. We need to take seriously the Bible as a piece of narrative literature and study it like we would study Chaucer or Dante or any of these great classics. And when they did that, they applied the techniques of narrative techniques, how authors compose narrative. The results were spectacular. Then these different accounts that looked contradictory were actually seen to be part of the author's strategy. And the gaps and the repetitions and all of this was seen as a highly sophisticated attempt of the author to convey meaning and teaching and theology and doctrine through these methods. And that is a method that I champion now. It's known as narrative criticism. Its champions were people like Robert Alter, Meyer Sternberg, Adele Berlin, Shimon Bar Ephrat, and through the work of these people, we have learned some amazing things about the way the narrative has been written, the way the authors wrote the narrative, and the meaning that we should get from it. Adele Berlin made a famous statement, which my friend and mentor Bruce Walke slightly tweaked, and that is, you do not know what a text means until you know how it means. So now we began to study not the history of the text, but really the history of the authors. What were they like, and what techniques did they use to give meaning and substance to their writings? And when we understand that, the text just opened up to us like you would not believe. We began to see things that we had never seen before. And it has, the results that it has yielded are literally astounding. And the Bible becomes sophisticated, these narrative portions become a sophisticated piece of art. In fact, Alter's seminal book is called The Art of Biblical Narrative, because really that's what it is. It is an artistic composition.
So if I hear you right, what you're saying is that when we see difficulties in the passages, what might appear to be contradictions, rather than seeing those as problems that we have to somehow solve, we should actually see them as intentional and clues as to really what the author is trying to get across.
Precisely. Take, for example, the example we just gave. It does appear on the surface that we have a contradiction as to how Saul met David. But think again. The first account is telling us about Saul needing a music therapist. And they find this young man. Now you need to understand a little bit of the history. Saul has already been told by now that he has been rejected, and that the Lord is going to raise up a man after his own heart to replace him. So this is in the background of Saul, and probably contributed to his melancholia or depression or whatever it was that he was suffering here. And so that's in the back of his mind all the time, and it's probably killing him. But somebody suggests this music therapist, and there is David brought into him, and Saul is blessed by David's music playing and relieved and so forth. But that is all he is to David for now. A great help to his problem. But then through a whole series of events, he sees David in a totally different light. Now here is this young person that he has known only as a music therapist, a gentle music therapist that helps him, going out to face the greatest threat against Israel's existence, that even he was too cowardly to face. That puts a complete new face upon David. And Saul, in the back of his mind is, somebody's going to replace me. And here is a person, and in that culture, distinguishing yourself in battle was one of the key characteristics of a true king. You had to be powerful in battle. And here is David now marching off to meet the champion Goliath. What is Saul thinking? Who is this guy? Like, I thought he was just this music therapist. But now he's going out to battle the Army, Navy, and Air Force of the Philistines. Is this the guy? Like, should I be looking at him differently? And now he wants to know more of his background to find out, is there something in David's background that might actually say kingship? And so that's I think, the reason why we have these two accounts. So now when we understand it in that way, we see it makes more sense to us than saying it's two sources. You know, author A wrote that David met Saul through music therapy. Author B wrote that he met him on the battlefield, and the city editor couldn't decide which one to use and put them both together, you know, and letting us work out the problems.
Right. So a few minutes ago that there are maybe some clues that there's more than one author involved here, although maybe sometimes traditionally we've thought of, actually when I think about the historical literature, the author, I can't think of who are the authors. I mean, some of the other books of the Bible, like prophetic books, have the author's name right on the book. But what about historical books?
Right. People often assume because the book is named Joshua,
right,
or the book is named Samuel, and so forth, that they are the authors of the book, but absolutely not. The incredible thing about these books, these historical books, is they are, all of them, anonymous. They come to us anonymous, which is incredible. Some of the greatest literature of the world comes to us anonymously. We just don't know who wrote them. For example, Samuel. Samuel is dead in 1 Samuel 25. Most of the action takes place after him, even though the book is called Samuel. So we really, trying to figure out the author is really a fool's errand, and I don't think we'll ever get to that. Instead, what we should talk of is a narrator. And this is this is a very important...
A narrator.
A narrator.
Okay.
A narrator is the person who is telling you the story. You ask yourself, or we never really ask ourselves, when we read, for example, the first words of the Bible, in the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth. Who is telling us that? Right? It's not God. He's one of the characters, actually, in the narrative. So who is that person? And the narrator is the one who mediates the story for us. He brings in each character into the story at a particular time and then sends them off the stage. He directs your eyes and thoughts to a particular place. And he changes the scenery for you, and so on and so forth. He is a silent, behind-the-scenes person that we are completely dependent upon the narrative for the story. Because the fact is, being a story, we do not have any other means to enter into it and figure it out for ourselves. We are completely and totally dependent upon the narrator. The narrator, as it were, takes us by the hand and leads us through the story. He says, look over there, and we have to look over there. We cannot, outside of him, look somewhere else and get something else out of it. We just can't. He leads us, and then he'll say, and now look over there. And then we have to look over there. We have no outside access into the story other than the narrator. Very powerful figure. We'll have to talk to him a little bit. We'll have to talk a little bit more about him. But a very unknown, unobtrusive, silent figure that we're hardly aware of. But without him, we have no story.